Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. In the long shadowed halls of medieval cathedrals where every whisper echoed like a prayer and each candle burned in solemn rhythm with chants, there came a day each year when that dignity was turned on its head. Quite literally, was called the Feast of Fools. You might imagine the Middle Ages as a time of strict order, a hierarchy and holiness, a place where monks copied manuscripts in icy scriptoriums, and peasants bowed to both priest and lord. And, in many ways, it was, but precisely because of that order, there arose strange days when the people, both high and low, would take that sacred pyramid of power and flip it upside down, just for a little while. And no feast embodied this as fully as the Feast of Fools. It's hard to say exactly when it started, Some say it grew from Roman Saturnalia, that topsy-turvy celebration where slaves were treated like kings for a day. Others say it was a kind of Christian parodian, a loud explosion of absurdity before returning to piety. By the 12th century, it had taken firm root in France and then radiated outward, growing into cathedral towns and villages across Europe. On the appointed day, often around the New Year or Epiphany, cathedral chapter would elect a lord of misrule or boy bishop. Sometimes he was a lowly deacon, sometimes a choir boy, always someone who would never taste real power, save for this brief carnival of absurdity, robed in mock finery and sometimes seated on an actual donkey. This faux bishop would take control of the cathedral. He might wear the mitre backward, or lead a mock mass in gibberish, or process through the town, flanked by other costumed clergy, all of them playing drums, blowing horns, and throwing straw or ash into the wind. Inside the church itself, the clergy would sing drunken hymns. They might burn stinky shoes instead of incense. Some parishes reported that actual dung was hurled at altars. Others swore that naked clergy danced in the nave, mooing like cows or braying like donkeys. Sacred liturgy was parodied with made-up Latin in the name of God, swapped for farm animal noises. To a modern ear, this might sound like heresy, blasphemy even. To many medieval Christians, it was part of the calendar, a strange valve that released pressure from a year of rigid control. You couldn't complain about your abbot in January, but you could dress like him and sing fart songs on the Feast of Fools. And somehow, that balance of order and disorder kept the machine running. In places like Rouen, Paris, and Sens, these celebrations grew elaborate. They involved full-on theater performances, mock burials, and parades where the dead rose from tombs. In Rouen, they dressed up statues of saints with animal heads. In Paris, the whole cathedral chapter processed behind a donkey whose braying was treated as sacred chant. In a sense, it was customary for the fake bishop to sit backwards on a cart and deliver a nonsensical sermon to howling townsfolk. And yet, this wasn't just about fun. The church tolerated it, even organized it, for deeper reasons. Medieval Europe was brutally hierarchical. Most people lived and died without ever questioning the social ladder. But once a year, they could joke about it. They could mock the bishop, pretend a pig was a pope, say out loud through satire what they would never dare say otherwise. And after laughing themselves sore, they returned to order, having spent their rebellion in safe, symbolic ritual. Still, not everyone approved. As early as the 13th century, reformers tried to clamp down on the feast. Bishops wrote stern letters. Synods declared punishments. In 1445, the Church Council of Basel condemned the festival, calling it a shameful and pestiferous abuse. In Paris, the university tried to ban students from participating, and yet the feast refused to die. Why? Perhaps because the chaos served a function that the church, deep down, understood. People need release, even priests. And sometimes, the safest way to preserve order is to allow disorder in a measured dose. And so, mockery went on. But who, you might wonder, actually participated in all this? Who dared to walk into a cathedral and moo like a cow? The answer is nearly everyone, from low-ranking clergy to cobblers, farmers, city guards, and even, in some cases, visiting nobles. Participation wasn't just permitted, was expected. Some towns levied fines on those who didn't take part. Key. In other places, the failure to dress absurdly or laugh along could be interpreted as snobbery or worse, secret heresy. 'Cause only someone trying to look holy all the time would refuse to bray like a donkey when the bells rang. Even children had their roles. Choir boys dressed in mock vestments. They sometimes crowned one of their own as bishop and conducted full church services, benedictions, and even burials. One English record from Salisbury in the 15th century describes a boy bishop leading processions, preaching, and receiving gifts from parishioners, all while the real clergy watched in amusement or mild horror. But was it all fun and games? Were these rituals truly harmless, or did they carry risks? There are hints in the historical record that sometimes things went too far. In some towns, the mock masses descended into drunken brawls. One chronicle from northern France describes a group of revelers urinating on an altar. Another speaks of candles being lit with pig fat and a holy relic used as a drinking cup. In response, certain cathedrals began locking their doors during the feast week. Others assigned guards, and a few quietly discontinued the celebration, burying it beneath a more acceptable festival like Epiphany. Still, the Feast of Fools lingered in some places until the 17th century, and echoes of it remain even today. In things like Mardi Gras or Carnival modern-day festivals where roles are reversed, masks are worn, and rules are suspended for just long enough to feel like freedom. And it makes you wonder, in a world so tightly wound with rules, was the Feast of Fools a moment of madness or a deeper kind of sanity? What did it mean to call a donkey a bishop and believe it just for a day? The Feast of Fools didn't simply explode into existence and then vanish in a burst of wine and laughter. It unfolded gradually across centuries, influenced by the slow churn of medieval seasons and the strange, secret logic of the liturgical calendar. To understand its endurance, one has to look deeper, not just at what happened on the day of the feast, how the rest of the year created the need for such unbound celebration. That the medieval year wasn't divided by quarters or fiscal charts. It was divided by saints, martyrs, solstices, and moments when heaven and earth drew close, sometimes alarmingly close. Time itself followed a rhythm dictated by divine mysteries. The days between Christmas and Epiphany were particularly special. Known as the 12 days of Christmas, they were considered a liminal zone, a kind of holy no man's land, a time outside of time. This is when the Feast of Fools typically occurred right after the strict, reverent observation of Christmas Mass, but before the final light of Epiphany marked the arrival of the Magi. And in this strange pause, the absurd could thrive. Was, in a way, the year turning inside out, inverting not only power, but time, responsibility, and sacred structure. Church calendars were complex tools. Monks and clerics followed them with disciplined devotion, tracking feasts, fasts, vigils, and vespers with a kind of metaphysical precision. But even they sometimes bent the rules. And for one day, bending wasn't just permitted, it was celebrated in certain dioceses. Preparations for the Feast of Fools began weeks in advance. Not unlike Lent or Advent, there was anticipation. Scripts were drafted for mock sermons. Costumes were sewn, often using scraps from discarded vestments. Local bakers prepared special treats shaped like church tool scrogers made of bread, communion wafers flavored with herbs. And in cathedral schools, the younger clergy in training practiced chants that replaced the Latin word Dio with mu. The crowning of the Lord of Misrule or boy bishop was often an elaborate ritual in itself. In Rouen, the ceremony took place in full view of the clergy, who played along with exaggerated solemnity. They handed over symbols of office closures, mitres, and books to a boy who might still be losing his milk teeth. He would then bless the crowd with ridiculous gestures, sometimes tripping on his own robes as the crowd howled with delight. And then came the procession. Across Europe, towns developed their own variations. In England, the feast sometimes merged with local customs from May Day or midsummer fairs. In Spain, it became entangled with epiphany parades, introducing elements of pageantry and even royal impersonations. In Germany, the ritual took on a darker tone, often mixing mischief with violent satire, mocking not only the church but local authorities as well. A recurring symbol was the donkey, known for its humble station and stubbornness. The donkey represented something deeply medieval, a beast of burden, yes, but also a witness to divine mystery. After all, a donkey carried Mary to Bethlehem, another bore Christ into Jerusalem. So, in the Feast of Fools, the donkey wasn't just a joke, it was a symbol, a mirror held up to power, a reminder that even the lowliest creature could be sacred, or at least briefly in charge. There was even a special chant, Orientis, part of Busan, during the Feast of the Ass portion of the celebration. Participants would bray the refrain in unison, echoing like wild hymns through church naves. Hez, Sire, As, Car Chanti, Belbouche, Racines, Vous Aurez, Du Foin, Assays, Et de l'Avoine à Plantes, which translates roughly to, Hail, Sir Donkey, sing forth now. Your lovely mouth grins wide somehow. You'll get enough hay to plow, and oats enough for your holy chow. And yes, at the end of each stanza, the congregation would bray loudly in a sacred space. This wasn't atheism. It wasn't mockery in the way a modern secular parody might be. To the medieval mind, the absurd lived side by side with the holy. There were saints who spoke to animals, demons who lived in wine barrels, angels who snuck into monasteries disguised as lepers. Laughter, strangeness, reversal, these weren't signs of disrespect. They were signs that mystery was alive and, well, but there was always a line. By the 15th century, concern about the feast had begun to rise. As Europe inched toward early modernity, and as centralized church authority began tightening, the tolerance for such revelry waned. What had once been a shared joke between clergy and layfolk began to look at least to archbishops and royal advisors like scandal, especially when secular audiences got involved. In some towns, the feast spilled into streets and taverns, attracting thieves, drunkards, and even prostitutes who took advantage of the loosened norms. Stories circulated of mock bishops demanding blessings in exchange for ale, of naked fools climbing belfries and urinating from above, of relics stolen during the chaos, never to be returned. One French bishop wrote bitterly in 1440, "We see God's house turned into a theater, where dancers defile the altar, where minstrels sing obscenities under the cross, and where a donkey brays his gospel from the pulpit." Still, in many towns, the clergy themselves resisted the crackdown. Some parishes created safer, controlled versions of the feast. They moved it outside the church. They shortened the duration. They created written scripts to control what could and couldn't be mocked. In a few places, Records show that real bishops participated, if only symbolically, blessing the boy bishop at the start and reclaiming their authority with grace at the end. What's perhaps most telling is how deeply this feast permeated cultural memory. Even after it faded, it left its fingerprints in literature, in festival traditions, in the quiet knowledge passed down through generations that sometimes it's the best way to keep order is to let it fall apart just for a while. And it raises uncomfortable questions. Were the fools really fools, or did they, in their silliness, reveal truths that ordinary speech could not? Could a donkey wearing a mitre speak wisdom no human bishop dared utter? And if the divine could be glimpsed through absurdity, what does that say about the solemnity we so carefully protect? By the end of the 15th century, the days of the Feast of Fools were numbered. What had once been a strange but accepted fixture in the medieval liturgical calendar moment of inversion, misrule and symbolic subversion was increasingly seen as incompatible with the tightening disciplines of church reformers and the rising pressures of centralized European monarchies. Still, before it faded into obscurity, the feast left one final legacy, a lingering lesson in the value of structured chaos. The late medieval church was entering a period of deep transformation. Councils were called, heresies rooted out, scholasticism refined the logic of divine order. Reformist voices, both within and beyond the Vatican, were calling for tighter controls, more solemnity, and a return to pure ritual. And to these reformers, the Feast of Fools, however rooted it had been in the rhythms of time and space, represented precisely the kind of blurred boundary that invited scandal. In 1445, the University of Paris issued a formal denunciation of the festival. Their decree decried the outrages committed in the very midst of divine services, listing drunkenness, indecency, and mock sermons as signs of moral collapse. They recommended excommunication for clergy who allowed such things in their cathedrals. It was a death knell. Yet, despite such condemnation, the festival did not vanish overnight. In smaller towns and rural communities, local versions of the feast continued. In these iterations, the mocking was gentler, the satire more symbolic. The boy bishop tradition, in particular, proved resilient, surviving even into the Protestant Reformation in parts of England, where it was occasionally adapted for secular civic festivals. Young boys, crowned with oversized mitres, would bless the town, lead parades, and distribute alms. What had once been a moment of religious parody had become a quaint civic ritual. But even in these quieter expressions, something of the old energy remained, a spark of rebellion, a willingness to flip the script. And that script had always been more complicated than it looked. One of the subtler, often overlooked aspects of the Feast of Fools was how it allowed lower-ranking clergy to voice frustrations without direct confrontation. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval ecclesiastical life, most priests and deacons lived under tight authority answerable to bishops, chapters, and canons. Their lives were narrow, repetitive, and bound by endless ritual. The feast, then, served as an outlet, a pressure valve through absurd sermons, songs, and costumed mimicry. They could criticize liturgical excess, mock bureaucratic decisions, or lampoon local corruption, without consequence. One understood it was just the feast, a joke, a tradition, nothing more. But the truths woven into humor have a way of lasting longer than formal decrees. Some of the most biting satirical verses from the feast era survive today in manuscript marginalia and preserved scripts. One such chant, adapted for the feast, translated from Latin, reads, "Blessed be the coin, for it forgives all sins. It absolves the glutton, the harlot, the prince. No need for penance, no time for prayer. A silver tongue redeems all care." Even the donkey, the so-called beast of the feast, was more than a joke. In a world where animals were often used symbolically in art and teaching, the donkey came to represent more than inversion. It suggested endurance, humility, and perhaps a critique of the stubbornness of church leaders themselves. In this way, the Feast of Fools wasn't anti-religious. It was deeply embedded in the spiritual logic of the time of logic, where mystery could coexist with nonsense, and where ritual could occasionally benefit from rupture. In some towns, records show bishops formally restoring order at the end of the feast with processions of their own. They would re-enter the cathedral with incense, hymns, and gravity, as if reconsecrating the space, a sacred reset. And so, even the act of closing the feast was part of the ritual itself, reminder that misrule was temporary, that order would return, but not without learning from its opposite. This interplay between chaos and structure didn't just vanish when the feast declined. It found other outlets. In the early 16th century, as Europe was racked by religious wars, peasant uprisings, and economic change, festivals continued to serve as mirrors of anxiety. Carnival traditions, particularly in Italy and the German states, grew in theatrical complexity, borrowing the same symbolic reversals of the feast, but placing them in more urban, secular frameworks. In Venice, elaborate masks allowed nobles and beggars alike to mingle without hierarchy. In Cologne and Basel, floats paraded images of gluttony, death, and power turned upside down. These were no longer strictly church-sponsored events. They belonged to the people, but their roots, deep, dark, can tangled lied back to the chancels and pulpits of medieval cathedrals. And here's where the story bends once again, because even in its decline, the Feast of Fools held on in the imagination. Writers, chroniclers, and later, even folklorists looked back on it with a kind of longing. Not necessarily for the braying, or the wine, or the Dunksmere theatrics, but for the space it represented. A space where laughter was not rebellion, but ritual, where breaking the rules was paradoxically part of keeping them. And in the quieter corners of medieval monasteries, you can still find traces of this memory. Marginal doodles of monkeys and miters, notes about fools' processions, a single word scribbled in a scribe's notebook beside a serious theological text. Amen, or maybe. Nay, it's tempting to dismiss the Feast of Fools as a footnote, a medieval oddity, blip on the sacred calendar. But history rarely moves in straight lines, and often it's the marginal, the foolish, and the forgotten that whispered the loudest truths. What if the feast had never been shut down? What might our world look like if laughter had remained liturgical? If inversion had been treated not as threat, but as necessity? What does it say about us that we remember the rules, but so easily forget the joy of breaking them just long enough to reset the soul? It was not in royal courts or cathedrals that most medieval people encountered the full flavor of festival life. It was in the alehouse, sticky tables, wobbly benches, smoky hearts, the clatter of dice and dogs and spoons in wooden bowls. This was the social theater of the medieval village and market town, and it was here, in the crowded space between barrels, where celebration happened, not always as spectacle, but as sustenance. Ale was more than drink. It was calendar, currency, and communion. And in festival season, it flowed not just from cups, but from the very heart of rural economic life in medieval England. By the 13th century, a curious custom had taken root, the ale feast. You might imagine a lord's banquet. But no, this was hosted by peasants, often women, in their own homes or barns. They would brew a particularly strong or fresh batch of ale, advertise the event with a sprig of evergreen on a pole above the door, invite the whole community to drink for a price. These weren't merely private parties, they were fundraising events. A woman might host an ale to raise money for church repairs, offer her daughter's dowry, or to help a neighbor pay a tax. Parishioners would pay to attend, and any profits after cost would go toward this stated cause. In time, these became so central to village finance that they were given a name, church ales. But church ales were never quiet affairs. Drinking was often accompanied by music, singing, rough games, and theatrical performances. The line between sacred fundraising and raucous mischief blurred easily. One contemporary priest grumbled that he could not tell whether his parishioners were raising money for God or the devil. And in this contradiction, holy cause, unholy method, we begin to see the deeper wildness of medieval festivals, because the economy of these events was communal, based not on coin alone, but on labor, favor, and face. If a neighbor helped you prepare food for your church ale, you owed them help at theirs. If you brewed poor ale, people remembered. If you hosted a feast that got out of hand, if too many fights broke out, someone's daughter ended up pregnant, well, that too would circulate in whispers and in songs. In this world, a reputation could be toasted or ruined with a single barrel, and that barrel was heavily taxed by the 14th century. Brewing ale required a license in most of England. Tasters, often appointed by local manorial courts, would visit each brew day to test quality and set fair prices. But festivals muddied this regulation. A particularly good ale feast could bring in 3 or 4 times the usual income. And so, some brewers skirted the rules using stronger fermentations, larger measures, or unlicensed helpers. In one village court record from 1362, a woman named Matilda Goodbrew, an ironic surname perhaps, was fined for serving ale at a Pentecost feast of such strength that 3 men did fall in the street and one forgot his name. Matilda protested that it was her special holiday batch and not for daily use. The court fined her 1 shilling, then quietly allowed her to continue. It was a wink and a nod. Everyone needed the feast to go on, and for women like Matilda, alehouses were one of the few avenues to public economic agency. In a society where landholding was largely male and trades often restricted by guilds, brewing offered independence. Alewives could set prices, negotiate sales, and cultivate customer loyalty. During festival season, this authority only expanded, but it came at a cost. Alewives were frequent targets of satire and suspicion. They appeared in mystery plays as temptresses or cheats. Monks wrote sermons comparing their brewing to witchcraft. One popular verse from the period reads, "The alewife's smile hides poison deep. Her cup is wide, her measures cheap. But drink her draught, and you shall see. Your purse is light, your wits shall flee." Still, people drank because they had to. Water was unreliable in many towns. Milk spoiled. Wine was rare. Ale was the drink of the people, mild, nourishing, and safe. And in festival times, it became a symbol of togetherness. Every sip was part of something bigger, especially when festivals blurred into economic survival. During lean years, poor harvests, livestock disease, war, taxation, festivals became lifelines. Community ales paid for sick neighbors' care. Spreens raised money for public grain stores. Traveling jesters and musicians, often dismissed in official records as vagabonds, brought news, laughter, and trade goods. And as festivals grew, so too did their markets. The most successful medieval festivals were anchored in fairs, legally recognized gatherings with special trading rights. A king might grant a charter to a town, allowing it to host a week-long fair each summer. Merchants would travel for miles, setting up booths for spices, cloth, tools, relics, and more. Inns filled, streets bustled, thieves thrived. Justice was suspended or outsourced to special fair courts. It was, for a week, another world, and ale was the grease that kept it moving. At Stourbridge Fair near Cambridge, one of the largest in medieval Europe, special festival brewhouses were erected just outside the trading grounds. These temporary structures served drink and food, to thousands. But they also hosted impromptu dances, music contests, and gambling games. It was part economy, part escape. Even kings noticed. Edward I once remarked that a fair success could be judged by the smell of hops and the noise of feet. And while hops were not yet widespread in English brewing, the point stands. A good festival made its mark on the senses, but not everyone approved. Moralists worried that too much celebration meant too little work. Guild leaders feared that unsanctioned festivals undermined trade discipline. Bishops balked at the noise and vice. And so, by the late 15th century, we began to see more attempts to regulate not abolish festivities. Ordinances were issued limiting music after sundown. Ale selling was restricted to certain days. Fairs were relocated from churchyards to neutral fields. And brewing, once a cottage industry, became more tightly controlled by urban authorities. But for the people, the festival endured, because it was not just entertainment. It was identity. You weren't just from Dunwich. You were from the town. With the midsummer ale, you weren't just a tenant. You were the one who danced with the Reeves' daughter during the maypole game. You weren't just poor. You helped raise the money to repair the church bell by selling meat pies at LAMMA's. In a world where records were few and names easily lost, the memory of festival rolls carried real weight. And beneath it all, there was a strange, steady rhythm marked, not by clocks, but by kegs. Ale at Candlemas, ale at Ascension, ale at harvest. Not all wildness is loud. Sometimes it's measured in the quiet blur between feast and finance, between survival and celebration. So how did something as simple as a drink become the scaffolding of a medieval joy? And what does it mean that our most enduring rituals, from toasts to taverns, still echo this old economy of gathering, giving, and getting just a little bit giddy? The wildness of medieval festivals wasn't only found in barrels of ale or the jangle of coin exchanged under striped fair tents. It was in the slower things, the preparation of bread ovens the week before the feast, the stitching of borrowed banners by lamplight, and the sudden invasion of out-of-town beggars who arrived not only to plead for alms, but sometimes to sing. Festivals, like markets, drew the margins of society toward the center. And in doing so, they created something chaotic but democratic, a temporary society where the cobbler, Pewth, the toothless friar, and the pig thief might all sleep within a few feet of one another, noses full of roast meat and the sulfur scent of fireworks, ears echoing with bells and blasphemy. Let's begin with the bread, because before ale could be served, and before songs were sung, someone had to feed the crowds. For most of the year, bread was simple, coarse, heavy, and baked in communal ovens by village women whose daily dough told the story of each household's fortunes. But for festival days, bread became something more ambitious. Finer flour was sifted, sometimes mixed with milk or honey. Decorative scoring appeared along the crests, and at the feast was tied to a religious observance, Corpus Christi, or a saint's day. Some loaves were baked into fish shapes or marked with sacred initials. In wealthier towns, bakers created banner bread, a curious combination of advertisement and offering. These were large loaves, often dyed with saffron or topped with sesame, and carried through town on wooden poles, each bearing the emblem of a guild, brotherhood, or family. After the procession, the bread was cut and distributed to the poor, but not all bread was shared fairly in London. During the feasts of St. Bartholomew, bakers were often accused of short-weight loaves. Records from 1381 note multiple fines issued for penny bread weighed but 5 ounces. In theory, a penny loaf should have fed a family. In practice, festival inflation meant that bakers trimmed their sizes while raising prices, blaming high flour costs, or greedy millers, or God's will. And so, another layer of wildness emerged not from revelry, but from resistance. Because Alongside the sanctioned parts of the feast, the licensed stalls, the church processions, the heralded tournaments, there was always an undercurrent of protest and parody. Some of it quiet, some of it loud. Let's talk about the banners. Every major festival had them. Stitched from wool, silk, or even rough canvas, painted or embroidered with coats of arms, saintly symbols, or mocking cartoons. Processions often began at dawn, with trumpets and drummers and the unfurling of banners that had been hidden all year. Guilds competed for the finest display. The butchers marched beside a blood-red flag featuring a cleaver and lamb. The weavers had gold-threaded sunbursts. The fishmongers paraded a literal cod, dried and painted and nailed to a staff. Sometimes banners bore riddles or snippets of Latin. Sometimes they simply showed a middle finger to a rival parish. But one year, 1422, to be precise, a particularly bold banner appeared in York's Corpus Christi procession. It bore a rough image of a tax collector being chased by pigs with the words, Veni, Vidi, Vamui, I came, I saw, I vomited. It was quickly removed by city officials, but not before dozens of onlookers had laughed, themselves breathless. The banner had been the work of a group called the Beggars' Choir. They were not official minstrels, or were they licensed jesters? They were vagrants, mostly, often traveling in small bands, some blind, some lame, some merely pretending to be. They made their living by song and by scandal, reciting lewd verses, parodying sermons, or retelling village gossip in rhyme. During festival days, they became ubiquitous. They loitered outside ale tents. They interrupted pageants with crude counter-performances. They called out lords by name and made fun of their moles. They sang in Latin. They sang in gibberish. They sang things they were not supposed to know, and people gave them coin, not because they approved, necessarily, but because laughter was part of the release. It is easy, from a modern distance, to think of medieval festivals as rigid and pious, to imagine long lines of devout townsfolk kneeling for relics, followed by a polite round of meat pies. But the truth is wilder, stranger, and more human. Medieval people were not just seeking entertainment. They were negotiating stress. The agricultural calendar was brutal. Disease loomed. Lords demanded rent. Church tithes drained coin. A year of poor weather could mean a year of hunger. And so, when the festival came, even if just for a day, offered catharsis, the priest might turn a blind eye. The mayor might join the dance. The beggar might sing a truth no one dared whisper in daylight. It was a ritual, not of obedience, but of inversion. The classic example of this is the Feast of Fools, celebrated most prominently in France, but also in parts of England and the Holy Roman Empire. This strange event took place just after Christmas. During the feast, lower clergy would mock their superiors, wear animal masks, sing obscene songs during Mass, and parade through town with donkeys, fake relics, and banners reading things like "Blessed be the beard of the Holy Goat." The point was not simply to laugh, it was to briefly unmake the order of the world. Some bishops tolerated it, others condemned it. One famous edict from 1445, issued by the Bishop of Sens, reads, "Let not young priests dance in church, nor wear women's garments, nor enter the altar with sausages." But how do you enforce restraint when the entire town is spinning? Wildness in these festivals was not just tolerated. It was anticipated. Structured chaos, a time when rules bent but didn't break, and the cobbler might dress as a bishop, and the baker as a knight, and the beggar as the pope. Some scholars call it ritual misrule, but in daily life, it was more than ritual. It was survival. And at the core of this annual disarray was the economy of favors. Lord might forgive a petty debt if he laughed at your juggler. A guild might recruit new members based on who danced most boldly in the procession. A tavern might win the season, not by lowest price, but by hiring the loudest fiddler or letting the butchers drink on credit. Even punishment could be suspended. During the Whitsun festivals in some English towns, a local criminal might be temporarily freed on guard to act in the community mystery play. Sometimes the part was ironic. A man accused of theft might play Judas. A known adulterer might portray King David. The crowd knew. They always knew. But they clapped anyway. Because the lines between story and reality blurred on feast days. And for just a few hours, everyone belonged to the same performance. And then the day ended. Banners folded. Bread gone. Ale dregs in the dirt. The beggars wandered off. The costumes were returned. The fines resumed. The world reasserted its usual cruelty. But something lingered. A joke, a song, a whispered confession behind the brewing tent. A feeling that even in a world of hierarchy and hardship, there were moments, brief, sacred, absurd, when the veil lifted and the village remembered its common heart. So what do we make of a world where laughter and economics, religion and rebellion, sausage and scripture all shared the same bench? And how did the temporary freedoms of festival life shape the permanent realities of medieval power? By now, you've walked the festival grounds. You've tasted the crust of decorative bread, heard the chants of the beggar's choir, watched men in muddy boots toss banners into the wind and mock the king's taxman. You've smelled, spilled, ale in the dirt, seen children carried on shoulders to catch a glimpse of a puppet play about the 7 deadly sins, and maybe even glimpsed a friar dancing with a goose tied to his wrist. It may have looked like freedom, but nothing in a medieval festival was free, not truly. Behind the wildness, the songs, the smells, the dancing fools, there was a structure, sometimes ancient, sometimes improvised. And while it might have felt like chaos to the outsider, it's to the people who lived and died by the rhythms of these events. The festival was a kind of performance that echoed the politics of the world beyond. Let's start with the most boring and essential part. Permits. Yes, even in the wildest times, someone had to apply for one. Festival days, specially traveling fairs, market feasts, and saint days required permissions from local authorities or noble patrons. Towns petitioned lords or bishops for licenses to hold a public feast, the right to set up stalls, to collect tolls, to use the town square or church green. All of this was a negotiation, and when those rights were granted, they came with strings. Often, the host town owed a cut of the revenue to the patron. The ale tax, the meat market tax, the coinage checked for forgeries at the gate. Some towns even charged performers to participate, charging minstrels, fire readers, actors, and bear baiters for the privilege of attracting a crowd. In other words, festivals were not gifts, they were investments. And the better the show, the greater the return. That's why guilds spent weeks preparing. That's why inns stocked more ale than usual. That's why even the poorest townspeople pooled coins to rent a costume or hire a drummer or buy colored cloth for bunting. Everyone was trying to draw attention, to increase foot traffic, to outshine the next stall, the next town, the next year. But the economics weren't just financial, they were political. When a mayor or alderman presided over a festival, they did so not merely as hosts, but as enforcers of social order. Processions were organized with strict rules. The tanners marched behind the blacksmiths, the pourers ahead of the coopers, and the weavers always, the loudest, were instructed to keep their banners from hitting shop windows. Any deviation could be read as protest. In 1362, a dispute in Norwich broke out during the Midsummer Watch Parade when the bakers insisted on walking ahead of the fishmongers. The argument escalated into a brawl, and the mayor later declared that no guild shall advance its colors unbidden, nor make proclamation above its station. So even in revelry, hierarchy mattered. And yet, those same festivals also provided rare spaces for defiance. Not overt rebellion, though that, sometimes happened too, but more subtle critiques entered the mummers. Mumming plays were short performances, part dance, part slapstick, part morality tale. They were popular across England, France, and the Low Countries, especially during Yuletide festivals and saints' days. The actors wore masks, spoke in exaggerated voices, and presented allegorical battles: good versus evil, winter versus summer, rich versus poor. In these plays, wealthy lord might be mocked as greedy and blind. A doctor character might resurrect the slain peasant with a dose of strong ale. Kings were ridiculed. Priests were impersonated, and yet, because it was all framed as theater, authorities often looked the other way. It was, after all, just play. Except that it wasn't. In 1389, a mumming troupe in Coventry was fined for sedition in rhyme. After performing a skit where a blindfolded taxman was led into a pigsty and declared a bishop. The performance lasted only minutes, but the ripple effects were felt for weeks. The local reeve was demoted. 2 players were exiled, and the town's petition for next year's feast was denied. Festivals had teeth. They were not only celebrations of abundance, but also sites of tension between freedom and control, between satire and offense, between joy and surveillance. And at the heart of it all stood the figure of the fool. Perhaps no character embodies the contradictions of medieval festivity more than the licensed fool, dressed in motley, spells on his cap, stick in hand. The fool was at once beloved and feared. He could speak truth without punishment. He could insult the bishop and earn applause. He could turn a court into a circus, but he walked a fine line in 1450. During the Feast of the Holy Rood in Salisbury, a well-known fool named Toby Longshanks made a joke about the local lord's mistress. The crowd howled. The mistress did not. By the next morning, Toby had vanished. Some said he fled to York. Others claimed he was pressed into silence by a guard's cudgel. What's fascinating is that despite these dangers, its festivals continued to feature fools, jesters, and parodists. Towns wanted them, lords enjoyed them, commoners idolized them because they gave voice to what could not otherwise be said in this way. The wildness of medieval festivals was deeply structured. It had roles, it had risks, it had rules, and rules meant something could be broken. Which brings us to the final piece of this strange economic puzzle: the enforcers. You might imagine that a medieval festival, bursting with a drink and dance and noise, was policed only by church officials or local bailiffs. But there was another force at play. The watch, the night watch, specifically, was tasked with maintaining order during the rowdiest hours of a feast. They patrolled the tents, broke up fights, seized counterfeit coins, and confiscated forbidden dice games. Sometimes they wore armbands. Sometimes they were indistinguishable from the crowd till their cudgels came out. Their goal was not to stop the fun, but to contain it. Alehouses that stayed open too late were shuttered. Fires were. Judgments were ushered home, and performers deemed unlicensed were marched to the edge of town and told not to return until next year. But the watch were also men of the town, which meant they could be bribed. A roast chicken here, a promise of free meat there, a quiet word from the mayor's cousin. And suddenly, the dice game was allowed to continue. The puppet show with risk scenes about nuns and monks was ignored. The beggar's choir, despite its reputation, was allowed to sing one more verse about the bishop's feet. In this web of negotiation, humor, and hierarchy, the medieval festival becomes clearer. It was a theater, not just of plays, but of people. A temporary stage where class lines blurred, where money could speak louder than law, where laughter acted as currency. And where truth wore a jester's mask, the wildness was real. The revelry was sincere, but underneath, always, was the reckoning. Because, as the final fires were extinguished and the festival carts rolled away, the town had to answer questions. Who gained power from this feast? Who lost it? What did the crowd remember, and what would they repeat when the next year's festival came around? So as we fold away the banners, sweep up the breadcrumb trails, and silence the pipes, we're left with a final image. A child sits beside an emptied barrel, still holding a wooden spoon used to bang the sides in rhythm with the beggars' choir. He's too young to understand the politics. He only remembers the songs, and maybe that's the real wildness, not the jesters or the fights or the masks, but the memory, how it clings to the scent of roasted onions and damp earth, how it survives in rhyme and rumor, how it shapes the story of a place long after the tent poles come down. So tell me, when wildness is organized and rebellion licensed, is it still rebellion? Or is it something older, quieter, and far more necessary? A pressure valve for the soul of a community that dares not speak except in jest. If you've ever thought festivals were all about joy and laughter, let's shift our focus to a strange medieval tradition that was as wild as it was unsettling. It's because for a few short weeks each winter, the church itself handed over power to a child. Not a joke, not a skit, a real ritual. A child dressed in full bishop's regalia, leading services, issuing orders, and presiding over clerical life while the adult clergy bowed, followed, and obeyed. He was called the boy bishop, and his festival was a carefully organized reversal of a Dora celebration of chaos sanctioned by those who claimed to uphold spiritual authority. It was a time when hierarchy inverted, rules softened, and power itself slipped into theatrical costume. But how did this strange tradition begin? What kind of society allowed a child to wear a mitre and chant sermons while grown men listened? To understand, you must first understand how deeply performative medieval religion could be and how festive traditions emerged, precisely where piety was at its peak. We began in the cathedrals. By the 10th century, large churches across England, France, Spain, and Germany were not just places of prayer. They were complex institutions, housing dozens, sometimes hundreds of clerics, including many boys in training. These choir boys and junior clerks were not simply students. They lived on site, followed a strict schedule of liturgical duties, and served the higher-ranking canons and priests. They were, in essence, junior monk's part servant, part apprentice, part singer of the daily mass. They rose at dawn. They memorized psalms. They learned to handle sacred books and chant Gregorian melodies. They also lived under rigid supervision. And yet, in the cold, dark days of December, something odd would happen. Somewhere between Nicholas Day, December 6th, and Childemus, December 28th, a boy would be elected bishop. The election was ceremonial, often involving all the boys in the cathedral chapter. Names were suggested, and sometimes lots were drawn. But often, it was the loudest, cleverest, or most well-liked boy who rose to the top. He would be dressed in full episcopal garments, alb, cope, crozier, and the tall bishop's mitre. He was paraded through the streets, the choir sang as though he were ordained. He was installed in the cathedral, sometimes even in the bishop's own seat, the cathedra symbol of spiritual authority, and for the next few weeks, everything turned upside down. The boy bishop presided over services. He delivered sermons written by adults, but read in his voice. He issued orders to the canons. These were often humorous or symbolic, but carried real force within the chapter. He visited city leaders. He sometimes even wrote decrees that made their way to royal courts or bishoprics. There was joy, yes, singing, feasting, and mock processions. boys playing at incense bearers, altar servers, even excommunicating roosters or dolls in parodies of church rites. But underneath the laughter lay something stranger, something deeper. Why did the church allow this? Why did the same bishops who ruled with iron authority, who silenced heretics, who dictated every syllable of the liturgy, suddenly step aside and let a child rule? The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, lies in ritual inversion. Just like the feast, a false another chaotic, sanctioned break in clerical decorum, the boy bishop tradition acted as a kind of safety valve. It gave voice to the suppressed. It mocked the sacred, and in doing so, it reinforced the very structures it seemed to you penned by letting the boys play bishop. The church reminded them who would one day wear the robe for real. It also reminded the grown clergy that their power was, in some sense, a costume. All robes, all rights, all roles could be borrowed, and if they could be borrowed, they could be lost. Still, some communities took the tradition too far. In Salisbury, one of the best documented centers of the boy bishop tradition, the miniature prelates became increasingly bold by the 13th century. Records show them visiting civic leaders, imposing fines on townsfolk, and even requiring local merchants to pay tribute in sweets or silver. The boy bishop became a kind of tyrant, cheerful, charismatic, and briefly unchecked. And the people loved it. They lined the streets, they sang the children's mass, they laughed at the sermons, which often mocked bishops, abbots, and even the king. But not everyone was amused. In 1542, during the Protestant Reformation, King Henry VIII abolished the practice by royal proclamation. He called it childish, superstitious, and unfit for a reformed realm. A few years later, Queen Mary I restored it tonally for Elizabeth I to ban it once again. But by then, the boy bishop had become a symbol, not just of festive inversion, but of something more elusive. How power, when costumed in innocence, reveals the absurdity of grown men's authority, and how tradition, when allowed to parody itself, comes more durable, not less. One wonders what the real bishops thought. Did they smile in the shadows, listening to their own faults echoed in a child's voice? Did they feel threatened? Could they wish, for just a moment, that they too could laugh at their role? Or had the ritual inversion lost its teeth? In time, the tradition faded. Some churches preserved the vestments of past boy bishops as relics, miniature robes, sized mitres, faded scrolls of mock sermons written in Latin, but most simply forgot. They moved on. They built new structures, new forms of piety, new ways to manage chaos without mockery. Still, the image lingers. A small boy in velvet robes, holding a golden staff too heavy for his hand. Standing in a stone cathedral that echoes with candlelight, he begins to chant, and the adults listen, not because they must, but because in this moment they believe. So we ask, was the boy bishop a parody of power or its purest form? Was he a warning or a memory of what leadership once meant before ambition, before politics, before ego? Was he just a game or something far older? A dream of a world ruled, however briefly, by those who still believe in songs more than sermons. By now, you've seen the child bishop seated in a great cathedral, dressed like an elder, but with cheeks still soft and voice still cracking. But this wasn't just a moment of local pageantry, it was a European-wide phenomenon, stitched into the fabric of cathedral life from England to France to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. In this section, we go deeper into the daily operations of the boy bishop's reign, the roles he played both symbolically and practically, and the strange way in which laughter, mockery, festivity acted as a strange form of control, like a snake coiled gently around the leg of order, reminding it how fragile it was, because no festival of chaos can exist without a tightly managed structure behind it. Let's step into the winter of 1299. In the cathedral town of Hereford, England, the wind outside howls through narrow streets. Chimneys spit smoke, and the windows of the town's inns and alehouses glow orange. Snow lies heavy in the gutters, but inside the cathedral, boys are busy preparing for one of the most unusual performances of the liturgical year. The boy bishop has been chosen. He's around 11. His name isn't recorded in the cathedral rolls, which tended to focus on land titles and permanent appointments, not temporary inversions. But we know what he wore from the cathedral treasury: a miniature cope of embroidered wool, stitched with gold and trimmed in red, a tiny mitre, too big for his head but padded with cloth, leather shoes, dyed black with ornate buckles, a crozier often carved from local ashwood and silvered at the tip. For the next week, he would preside over real rituals, yes, real ones, on December 6th. The feast of St. Nicholas, the patron saint of children. The boy bishop led a solemn procession through the cloisters. He chanted hymns. The younger boys followed behind, carrying candles and laughing quietly. But behind them came something stranger still: the adult canons. These were men of learning, discipline, and age. But during this week, they followed their small superior in solemn mock submission. Some would even kneel. Others made gestures of deference, bowing as the child entered the chapel or crossing themselves at his blessing. Did they believe the blessing held power? Probably not, but that wasn't the point. The boy bishop wasn't about faith. He was about relief. In a world of exacting doctrine, cold stone walls, and daily monotony, the festival offered release, not for the boys, many of whom had entered cathedral life as early as 7. It was one of the only times Teats saw adults yield. Now, consider this: the boy bishop didn't just walk around and smile. He had duties. He gave sermons, sometimes written in verse, sometimes in crude parody of the Latin homilies he had memorized. There are records of boy bishops giving mock sermons about pigs flying into heaven, or frogs teaching monks how to sing. He issued edicta for Rome, children's decrees. These were often humorous but required obedience from the choir school. Things like, all boys shall eat sugared figs after vespers. The master of grammar must wear a fool's cap during instruction. Every boy who forgets his lines must recite them backwards before dinner. On Cheldamus, no boy shall bathe unless it be in snow. Yes, ridiculous. But they were copied down and stored in cathedral archives like any other liturgical note. This was not just plate, was ritual play. And that distinction mattered, because behind the humor lay a powerful idea. The church could absorb inversion without collapsing, that it could mock itself, and by doing so, reinforce its dominance. The boy bishop's reign was short of it, just from December 6th to December 28th, ending the deeply symbolic feast of the Holy Innocents. On this day, the church remembered the children slain by Herod in his quest to kill the infant Jesus. There was mourning. There were dirges sung in minor key, and often this marked the end of the child's reign. In some places, the boy bishop would even die, Ceremonially. He was led out of the cathedral, his mitre removed. Sometimes a funeral mass was sung mockingly, but with serious music. The child, now restored to mere choir boy, returned to his old place at the end of the pew. What had he learned? What had the people learned? No one knows for sure, but the theatricality of it all may give us a clue. The Middle Ages were, in many ways, a performance culture. Ceremonies mattered more than rules. Appearance held more weight than argument. People believed in signs, symbols, and holy patterns. The boy bishop was one of those patterns, a break in the structure that, paradoxically, strengthened the structure, a reversal that proved the order was intact. But sometimes, things got out of hand. in Rouen, France. Records from the 14th century show boy bishops issuing edicts against local butchers, accusing them of selling unholy sausages. In Toledo, Spain, a boy bishop once paraded through the Jewish quarter, throwing sugared almonds and demanding blessings from the rabbis. In Lincoln, England, boys once broke into the treasury during the feast, stealing wax candles and pouring them into snow molds to make sculptures of their teachers. Most of these were dismissed as harmless, but not all. When the Reformation came, these traditions were among the first to be outlawed. The reformers believed in simplicity. They distrusted inversion. The idea that a child could mock a bishop, even for 1 week a year, felt blasphemous. Too close to idolatry, too close to laughter, so they banned it. But in doing so, they lost something ancient, a memory of play woven into worship, a sense of ritual disorder, carefully controlled, and perhaps, most significantly, they lost a way of reminding the powerful that their authority was, in the end, matter of agreement, not absoluteness, because for a few weeks in December, everyone had agreed, this boy rules now, and by pretending he did, they reminded themselves what real leadership might look like: humble, small, smiling nervously in oversized shoes. Now, imagine you're there in one of those stone cathedrals. The candles flicker, the incense curls upward like breath in winter air. The boy bishop stands, hands trembling slightly, preparing to read the next line from a scroll handed to him by an actual cleric. He clears his throat, and in the silence, you hear the memory of laughter, of rebellion, of inverted roles, all contained within the sacred walls. Was this a moment of chaos or a reflection of deeper order? And when it ended, when the boy removed his vestments and returned to silence, what echo remained in the cathedral stone? So far, we've seen the boy bishop as both jester and priest, performing blessings with a crooked grin and leading choirs with the solemnity of old men. For a brief time each year, children were kings, mockery was liturgy, and the church played along. But as the world changed, through plague, through Reformation, through the tightening grip of rationalism, this strange and sacred joke began to wither. Not immediately and not everywhere, but it faded like old candle smoke curling through the rafters of stone cathedrals. This final section looks at the damned, the afterlife of the boy bishop tradition. We'll trace its slow suppression, explore why it mattered to the people who kept it alive, and ask a simple question that still lingers in empty chancels and ancient playbooks. When you remove the inversion, what does authority become? Begin in Tudor England around the mid-1500s. Henry VIII had just pulled England from Rome's grasp, not with a shout of theological triumph, but with a declaration of personal control. The break from the Catholic Church wasn't about belief, it was about the king's ability to overrule the Pope. But once the breach was made, others took advantage. Protestant reformers, inspired by Martin Luther, Zwingli, and later Calvin, began sweeping through every ritual with the sharpness of new doctrine. They demanded simplicity, sobriety, solemnity, and most of all, reverence. There was no place for mock bishops in their vision. In 1542, the boy bishop tradition was officially banned in England by royal proclamation. The order stated that such inversions were childish trifles intending to the maintenance of foolishness. The clergy were instructed to prevent the practice in all cathedral schools and monastic institutions. Yet, it didn't vanish overnight. In towns like York, Durham, and even small places like Barnstaple, the courts show attempts to smuggle the tradition back in. A 1544 letter from a disgruntled schoolmaster in Ely complains that boys were seen to don robes and process at the vesper hour, claiming the blessing of Nicholas. In Wells Cathedral, choristers secretly celebrated the Feast of Holy Innocents in 1546, hiding vestments in the crypt and bribing adult canons with sweetmeats to let it continue. For these children, Okay, and for the communities around them, the tradition wasn't just nonsense, it was memory. It reminded the old monks of when they were boys. It reminded townsfolk that even the mighty could be mocked. In it, reminded the boys themselves that the line between leader and follower was not carved into heaven. It was drawn and redrawn every winter by Firelight. In Europe, the suppression came more slowly. In France, the boy bishop or évêque d'enfance was sometimes tolerated well into the 17th century, especially in dioceses with strong local identities. But with the rise of absolutist monarchies and the increasing power of state over church, these rituals became risky. By 1700, the custom had largely vanished, and yet, like many medieval things, thought dead, it echoed. Let's look at those echoes in some parts of Germany. Children were still elected as mock mayors or Kinderbergmeister well into the 1800s. In Belgium, there are records of mock masses performed by youth chorales, where one boy led the prayers wearing a paper crown. And in parts of Spain, on December 28th, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, a similar tradition called the Fiesta de los Locos persisted. Adults dressed as children, and children as adults. The lines blurred again in these places. The boy bishop was gone, but not forgotten. Key's spirit wandered like a mischievous wind through liturgies in town squares, popping up in carnival, in Epiphany, in the strange theatricality of local saints' days. Now, why does any of this matter? Because when we examine a tradition like the boy bishop's, something so seemingly ridiculous, so fragile, so easily crushed by reform, we uncover something deeper, the human need for release, even in the most rigid systems. People seek the crack, the loophole, the week when the world flips upside down. These aren't accidents. They are designs. In ancient Rome, it was Saturnalia where masters served slaves and gambling was allowed. In medieval towns, it was the Feast of Fools, the Carnivalesque, the Misrule, and in the church structure, built on sacred hierarchy, was the boy bishop for one fleeting moment. The latter was turned on its head. But perhaps more importantly, the tradition reminded the church of something terrifying. It was only one generation away from total collapse. These boys weren't strangers. They weren't outsiders, pupils, future priests. They were being trained to carry the structure forward. And yet, the structure allowed them to mock it because, deep down, it knew that mocking wasn't destruction. It was a rehearsal. The boy bishop was not the enemy of the church. He was its mirror. So what happens when you remove the mirror? In the centuries that followed, the church became increasingly formal, intellectual, and top-down, de-emotional and participatory. Festivals of inversion were replaced with printed catechisms, scheduled confessions, and doctrine-heavy sermons. People became listeners, not participants, and slowly, the sense of ritual play eroded today. In some places, there are attempts to revive the tradition, not as a genuine inversion of power, but as a quaint historical reenactment. In Hereford Cathedral, children once again dress as bishops on December 6th, but the sermons are written by adults. The choirs sing. The laughter is hushed. It's no longer a subversion. It's a performance about a performance. And perhaps that's the final echo, a pale imitation of a once dangerous joke. But still, if you listen closely, you might hear it in the soft rustle of vestments stitched for a child's shoulders, in the giggle before the hymn, in the slight, knowing nod of an elder canon as a 10-year-old waves a crozier, offering blessings with wide eyes and two big gloves. They all remember, or at least, their bones do. And if you sat in one of those ancient cathedrals late at night, with the wind howling through the high windows and the candlelight dancing against stone, you might wonder, what does it mean that for hundreds of years, the church allowed itself to be mocked from within? What was it trying to teach? And what might we have lost when we stopped letting children wear the crowns even just for a week? Long before Rome was carved into a marble museum, long before St. Peter's Basilica cast its grand shadow over the cobbled square, the throne of the papacy was not always occupied by marble-minded men in gilded robes. Timely, rarely, murmur would rise from the edges of Christendom, and from a peasant's mouth would come a claim too heavy for their shoulders, too holy for their skin, and the world would listen, not always out of belief, but out of fear. This is the story of peasant popes, of barefoot boys who claimed to speak for God, of shepherds who wandered from the hills and ended up shaking the seats of emperors. Let's begin not in the center of Rome, but in the hills of Avignon, in the southern corner of France, warm, fragrant, and tangled with vines. It is the year 1391, and the papacy is already divided. Two men claim to be the vicar of Christ, one in Rome, one in Avignon, both appointed, both opposed. Europe is split nations, aligning not with holiness, but with strategy. Kings choose their pope the way they choose a sword, for utility, not virtue. In this chaos, a young shepherd named Jean watches from the sidelines. He is no scholar. He cannot read Latin. He's never stepped foot inside a university. His home is a stone hut near the edge of a vineyard, and his daily tasks include chasing goats, boiling nettles for broth, and praying, always praying that the fever doesn't return. But something strange begins to happen, according to fragments of testimony preserved in inquisitorial scrolls. Jean begins speaking in fluent Latin during his sleep. At first, his parents think it's madness, then prophecy. He begins to chant fragments of scripture that no one taught him. He wakes with visions of angels arguing in fields. He draws strange geometric patterns in the mud with a stick and insists they represent the crooked bones of the church. Soon, others notice local villagers, tired of the endless quarrels of distant bishops, begin gathering around. Jean, as he speaks, he never says he is Christ, never calls himself the second coming, but he whispers something stranger. I have seen Peter, and he has handed me the keys. Word travels fast. By spring, Jean is led to a nearby monastery for questioning. The monks expect delusion. What they find is a boy with fire in his eyes who names every apostle in order and recites obscure passages from apocryphal gospels. He predicts a plague that does, in fact, strike the region weeks later. He refuses food for days, claiming that the bread of heaven has already filled him. He is not ordained, he is not confirmed, but within a few weeks, people begin calling him Papa Giovanni, Little Pope John. He wears a rough linen robe. His crozier is a carved stick. His mitre is a folded napkin. The people kneel, some out of wonder, some out of desperation, and some out of hope that maybe, just maybe, this shepherd child might be the one to finally speak for God, not in Latin, not from a throne, but from the dirt, of course. The real popes respond, and they respond with fury, from both Rome and Avignon. Proclamations go out condemning Jean as a heretic, a false prophet, and a vessel of satanic delusion. Killing him outright might make him a martyr, and martyrs are worse than rebels. They grow. So instead, they undermine. Pamphlets circulate, calling him the goat herd, blasphemer. Clergy are ordered to preach against him, but the peasants don't listen, because Jean speaks their language, not Latin, but hunger. He talks about sharing bread, about forgiving debts, about a church where no bishop shall wear shoes unless his flock also wears them. By summer, thousands gather to hear him. He never builds a palace. He builds bread lines. He never blesses gold rings. He kisses sick children. And through it all, he never crowns himself pope. But others do. They carry him on their shoulders. So crude vestments from grain sacks. They construct a wooden throne and set it in a meadow beneath a tangle of olive branches. And there, Cain begins to ordain others. He lays hands on illiterate farmers. He appoints young women as apostles of warmth, commanding them to bless the dying and rebuke cruel husbands. He invents roles the church had never seen before: shepherd, deacons, field confessors, key, mothers of the meal, to Rome and Avignon. This was not just heresy, it was a revolution, because a church that no longer needed cathedrals, a church that met in meadows and caves, was a church that could spread like fire. Jean's movement became known as the humble flock. No rules, no relics, just gatherings, singing, eating, forgiving. He never took up arms. He didn't need to, because his ideas walked into villages before soldiers did, and left more converts than wounds. But nothing so simple lasts forever. In the autumn of 1392, Jean was captured, not by papal guards, but by local nobility, concerned that his message would erode land rights. He had begun suggesting that the soil should belong to the ones who till it, that vineyards should be shared, that lords should eat only after their poorest had eaten twice. Dangerous words. He was brought to a damp cell in Marseille, interrogated by clergy, sent by both popes. They expected resistance. He gave them poetry. He spoke of rain falling on rooftops, of the silence in a chapel when no one prays, of the way goats follow the weakest in the herd. When asked directly, "Are you the Pope?" he replied, "No, I am the dust he walks on." In the end, they could not decide what to do. Killing him might spark revolt. Imprisoning him gave him followers in every prison, so they exiled him far north, into cold, into obscurity. Some say he died alone in a stone hut, whispering blessings to snowflakes. Others say he crossed into Bohemia, where the seeds of another peasant reform movement would bloom centuries later in the hands of Jan Hus and the Hussites. Either way, Jean disappeared, but the idea did not. Other shepherd popes would rise, some in Italy, some in the German forests. Most would be crushed. A few were burned. One was crowned with a crown of thorns made of vine roots and paraded through a city before being thrown from its walls. Yet, every few decades, a new peasant would speak, a new vision. And each time, the church would tremble just a little, because if power could come from dirt, if papacy could rise from hunger, if holiness could wear no shoes, then what did that say about the stones of Rome? And what does it say now when the world forgets them? Not the popes of marble, but the children, the shepherds, the goat herds who dared to bless and walked barefoot through thrones. It was the year 1469, and the mountains of the Tyrol region, nestled deep in the Austrian Alps, were experiencing something they had not seen in nearly a generation. Total spiritual silence, not because the villagers had lost their faith, but because no priests had come for months. The snow had fallen too early, the trade routes were blocked, and the clergy, who had once roamed from hamlet to hamlet collecting tithes, offering mass, and hearing confessions, had either been killed in a plague, conscripted into a local lord's militia, or simply vanished, afraid of the spreading whispers of heresy and reform that had begun to echo from Bohemia and beyond in this spiritual vacuum. A man appeared. His name was Matthias of Brenner, though no one remembers his last name, just Matthias, or sometimes Matthias the Patch, due to the elaborate series of sewn rags on his long brown coat. He was not young, he was not glowing. He walked with a limp and had one eye permanently swollen shut. He was a tanner by trade, filthy, thankless profession. He boiled animal hides and urine, scraped fat from dead oxen, and often smelled like decay. In most towns, tanners were forced to live on the edge of settlements, near rivers or pits. They were the unclean of the unclean died, yet Matthias spoke with the clarity of a seasoned preacher, not loudly, not theatrically, but in a slow, gentle cadence that made people lean in just to hear him finish a sentence. He spoke of the original church, the one of Peter and Paul, who knew not cathedrals, but caves. He quoted scripture, not the shiny, sanitized verses repeated in pulpits, but strange, esoteric lines about the meek, the fools, the beasts of burden, being closer to God than kings. And then, slowly, he began to perform rites. At first, it was small things. He blessed bread during village feasts. He anointed the dying with mountain herbs. He prayed over sick goats and children, the same trembling voice. And when someone asked him, jokingly, if he was now a priest, he shook his head and answered, "Priests stand above. I kneel beneath." But people began kneeling before him anyway, because when no priest comes for a year, when babies die unbaptized, when marriages go unblessed and deathbeds go silent, anyone who offers peace becomes a shepherd. Matthias offered more than peace. He offered structure. He told the villagers of his vision, not one of grandeur, but of a new church, not led by cardinals or dukes, but by the hands of laborers. He wrote his own modest code, scratched onto animal skin with burnt twig. Let no man rule who cannot work. Let no rule stand that does not serve the weak. Let no meal be eaten unless it is shared. He claimed he had seen in a dream Christ seated among tanners, scrubbing the flesh from a hide and laughing with fishermen. He was not wearing gold, Matthias said. He was not flanked by angels. He was tired, and he was pleased. This vision spread like wildfire. It came at the perfect moment. Bohemia was reeling from the long tale of the Hussite wars, and many refugees had fled across the Alps. These were people already suspicious of church hierarchy, people who had fought for utraquism, the right of the laity to receive both bread and wine during communion, a right denied to the common man by Rome. To them, Matthias was no heretic. He was a continuation. And so, for the next winter, the Tanners' church was born. It had no cathedral. Its sanctuary was a circle of rocks and pine stumps. Its altar was a flat piece of granite that caught snow. Matthias never called himself Pope, but others did. They nicknamed him Papa Brongatella, teasing term meaning Pope of the Brown Belt, in reference to his crusted leather apron, and slowly crossed the valleys. Farmers began refusing to tithe to the absentee church. They instead offered their barley and cheese to Matthias's stewards, volunteer monks, most of whom had never read a word of Latin but knew how to pull a tooth, mend a wound, or birth a cow. Villages built common bread ovens, as instructed by the tanner's rule. They renamed Sunday the Day of Dust, time to clean the poor and wash the feet of every neighbor. It all seemed gentle, almost too gentle, but Rome noticed. Word of this tanner's pope reached the ears of Pope Paul II, who had only recently taken the seat and was already obsessed with rooting out any new heresy. He had just banned printing presses in the Papal States, fearing the rapid spread of unauthorized thoughts. To him, this was no minor curiosity. This was a threat, so he dispatched Inquisitor Friedrich Staller, a hardened ecclesiastical judge from Salzburg, known for his ruthless dismantling of the Waldensians a decade prior. Staller arrived in the Tyrol, disguised as a wandering monk, tending one of Matthias's open-air masses. He later wrote in his record, "I expected lunacy. What I found was simplicity. There were no chants, no relics, just a circle of people washing one another's hands, sharing bitter soup, and reading from scraps of scripture etched into leather." He interviewed Matthias personally, and Matthias, old and wheezing, asked him, when did washing feet become a sin? Staller had no answer. The investigation dragged for months, and meanwhile, the Tanners' church grew. Pilgrims came from as far as Bavaria and Moravia. They brought garlic and candles instead of coins. They carried their own bedrolls, tea, and, when asked what they were seeking, they often said, a church that remembers what hunger feels like. Eventually, Matthias's health began to fail. One day, during a snowstorm, he collapsed while chopping firewood near a shrine to Saint Erasmus. He died a few hours later, surrounded by tanners, milkmaids, and a young girl who had been blind in one eye before he laid his hand upon her face a week earlier. Matthias was buried beneath a tree knot in a tomb, not in robes, and on his gravestone, if it can be called that, someone carved, "He smelled like ash, and he blessed like rain." The church, now leaderless, began to wither. Without Matthias's calm authority, factions formed. Some wanted to continue as a spiritual community. Others wanted to build a true alternative church with bishops and laws. By spring, Rome moved in. Inquisitor Stala returned, this time with guards. Several monks were arrested. The shrine was burned. Matthias's grave was exhumed and desecrated, declared an unholy site. But the damage had been done for nearly 2 years. Peasant-led papacy had operated in the Alps, and it had fed more mouths than Rome did in a decade. Its memory did not vanish. It was carried in songs, encoded prayers, and in the leather pouches of wandering tanners who whispered the rule to children before bedtime. Even today, in the Tyrolean countryside, there remain rumors of small stone chapels where no priest has ever been assigned, yet candles still appear. Every year on the anniversary of Matthias's death, and perhaps that is the lesson of the shepherd popes, that sometimes the loudest defiance comes not with swords or sermons, but with a bowl of broth, a kiss on a dying forehead, and a hand that smells of animal hide. Not every pope wore silk. Some wore patchwork and frost, and perhaps somewhere in the highlands they still do. In the pages of formal ecclesiastical history, there is barely a mention of the shepherd popes. Their names are not carved into marble plaques in Rome. Their decrees are not bound in illuminated manuscripts. Their portraits were never commissioned. And yet, despite the lack of formal record, their memory persisted, passed not through ink or institution, but through ritual, rumor, and ritualized forgetting. In some ways, the absence of their recognition is the legacy itself a reminder of how power selects what it remembers. But if one knows where to look, the fingerprints of these quiet insurrections remain, not in cathedrals or chronicles, but in songs, customs, and small acts of spiritual defiance that outlived the regimes that tried to stamp them out. Let's begin in a most unlikely place, the public ovens of eastern France. Throughout the late 15th and early 16th centuries, many villages across the region of Franche-Comté began a strange Sunday practice. After Mass, a group of villagers would gather at the communal bread oven, not to bake, but simply to wash it, with water, with cloths, with murmured blessings. There are no surviving records to explain this ritual, but in one village, a wandering priest named Brother Terence, writing in Eton Wu by Archese, noted in his diary, they say the oven must be cleaned, for the holy man once said, no bread should be baked in pride. They do not name this man, but they speak of him with reverence. Who was this unnamed figure? No saint of the church issued such instructions, but Matthias the tanner, who we met in the last section, had included this rule in his parchment codex. Let no meal be prepared without humility. Let fire be cleaned with water before it feeds the mouth. Centuries later, his words seem to echo disguised as a peasant's superstition. Similarly, in the hill towns of northern Italy, shepherds and farmhands celebrated a curious feast on February 3rd, not a canonical holiday. They called it La Giornata di Senarlieve, the day of soft ash. They would gather by a fire, burn dry herbs, and whisper verses as they rubbed ash on their hands. Then they'd bake small loaves, sometimes bitter, always unleavened, and leave them at crossroads or in animal troughs. No one seemed to know why, but a monk named Paolo Manganelli, writing in 1581, observed, They honored no saint that Rome recognizes. They say it is for the one-night brother who walked with goats and carried no cross, yet bore light in his hand. A tanner, a shepherd, a forgotten preacher with one swollen eye. It's possible that these rituals were not merely acts of nostalgia, but of resistance, spiritual protests hidden inside everyday gestures. After all, what could the church do with a peasant who claimed no title, founded no doctrine, and built no formal hierarchy? There were no armies to crush, no writings to burn, no structure to dismantle. The shepherd popes offered no heresy in the traditional sense, only the troubling question: what if we no longer need Rome? In time, that question would become louder. The quiet murmurs of the 15th century, caves and prophets would ripple forward, finding echoes in the Anabaptist movements, the radical wing of the Reformation, and even in the makeshift home churches that sprang up across 17th century England. The Anabaptists, for example, rejected infant baptism, hierarchical clergy, and state-sponsored religion. They insisted on the priesthood of all believers. And in the writings of Hans Hut, a lesser-known early Anabaptist preacher, there is a passage that reads, "The shepherd leads not from the front, but from within the flock. He smells of wool, not incense." This quote is nearly identical to a verse Matthias, the tanner, was said to have recited by firelight. A true shepherd is not the voice above, but the warmth within. He smells of ash, not gold. Coincidence? Perhaps. But for historians of the Radical Reformation, such overlaps are not uncommon. Ideas suppressed in one century often resurface in new costumes, finding safe harbor in different names, but carrying the same pulse. And what of Jean of Narbonne, the goat-herding boy pope from the Pyrenees? His story became legend. He died before reaching 20, possibly stoned to death by a mob stirred by frightened nobles. But in the Occitan-speaking regions of southern France, his tale was told in hushed voices for generations. There, he was not seen as a heretic, but as a child martyr, a boy who had seen angels and tried to build a heaven made of hay and shared cheese. 17th century Occitan lullaby begins. Sleep now, Jean of Narbonne, your goats all fed, your feet all worn. The stars remember your quiet crown of bramble, thorns, and shepherd's horn. In this way, the shepherd popes did not vanish. They became folklore. They transformed into parables of resistance, more felt than documented, more lived than codified. In their deepest legacy, it was not in what they taught, but in how they made people feel. For a peasant in 1470, kneeling on frozen earth beside a wooden bowl of broth, it may have been the first time someone told them they didn't need to buy salvation, didn't need Latin to be holy, didn't need to be clean to be seen in a world of inherited unworthiness. They offered dignity. That was dangerous. That was revolutionary. And that's why, though the shepherd popes left no stained glass windows, no cathedrals, and no scrolls of doctrine, they still lived on in tiny gestures, in small kindness, in the way a poor mother wraps bread in a cloth before giving it to a neighbor, in the way an old man whispers a blessing over a pot of soup, even if he's never set foot in a church, in the unofficial, the unrecognized, and the unshakable faith that there is more holiness in hunger shared than in gold untouched. Perhaps the church feared them not for what they said, but for what they reminded people of, that the earliest church began with dusty feet, fish bones, and men who never thought themselves holy, and that when all the incense fades, all the marble crumbles, and all the titles turn to ash, what might remain is something very quiet, a whisper, a broken man with patched sleeves, kneeling beside you, saying nothing, but in his silence, you feel the warmth of something ancient, and suddenly you believe again, even without a crown, even without a pope. When we think of medieval festivals, we might picture grand processions or solemn masses held under the towering spires of cathedrals. with elegant dances performed by nobility and the clergy. However, the true wildness of medieval celebrations often unfolded at the fringes, at the very edges of what was considered acceptable. The most notable and the most outlandish of these festivals was undoubtedly the Feast of Fools, an event that shook the church to its core, while also offering a glimpse into the freedom and spontaneity that lay behind the official practices of medieval life. The Feast of Fools was held during the Christmas season, usually on New Year's Day, and it was not a solemn observance, but a chaotic, raucous, and surprisingly subversive event. What began as a local celebration soon became an annual fixture in many parts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. On this day, the normal social and religious order was turned on its head, and the very rituals of the church were parodied in the most absurd ways. At the heart of the Feast of Fools was the election of a mock bishop or boy bishop. But this wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was the embodiment of ritual inversion, theatrical and temporary dismantling of the hierarchy that governed everyday life. The real bishop, with his flowing robes and powerful position, was temporarily dethroned by a young boy, often a choir boy, who would sit in the bishop's chair and preside over mock ceremonies. The boy bishop didn't merely sit idly. He became the symbolic leader for the day, with real authority in a ritualistic sense. The clergy and the people would gather around, laughing and mocking the holy rituals, even as they performed them. The boy bishop would deliver mock sermons, and the lower clergy would dress as nobles, while the noblemen often dressed as peasants. There were processions of drunken revelers, games that poked fun at religious practices, and, at times, even lewd performances. But where did this strange tradition come from? Its roots can be traced back to ancient Roman festivals like Saturnalia, a festival dedicated to Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture and time. Saturnalia was a time when masters served their slaves, gifts were exchanged, and a general reversal of roles was observed. The customs of Saturnalia filtered into medieval Europe, becoming part of the local winter celebrations and merging with Christian traditions. The Feast of Fools, however, was not just a temporary escape from reality. It was also a reflection of deep tensions within medieval society. These festivals revealed a society that was highly stratified, rigid in its hierarchical structures, yet capable of moments of release, a chance for people to laugh, to reverse roles, to take back just a few hours of freedom. In fact, it was the outsiders, the people on the lowest rungs of society, who often had the most fun at these festivals. Peasants, beggars, and the physically deformed were often invited to participate, making the Feast of Fools one of the few times in the medieval year when people from all social classes could mingle on equal footing. A beggar might become a mock king, while a nobleman might be forced to serve food or perform a clumsy dance in front of a crowd. This inversion of roles wasn't just for fun. It was an acknowledgement that power and status were fragile, often determined by birth, but not necessarily by merit at times. The Feast of Fools blurred the line between sacred and profane to such an extent that it even caused outrage among church authorities. As early as the 12th century, some bishops began to complain about the raucous nature of the event. And by the 15th century, the official church was actively trying to suppress it. In 1431, Pope Eugene IV issued a papal bull condemning the Feast of Fools, accusing it of encouraging drunkenness, immorality, and mockery of sacred rites. Despite the bans, the feast continued to be celebrated, especially in France and Germany, where it was seen as an important tradition for the common people. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Feast of Fools was its use of the outsider, marginalized person who was often invited to take on sacred roles for the day. This included not only the boy bishops and mock popes, but also beggars, fools, and even the physically disabled. It was a world where disorder ruled, but that disorder wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. It was a critique of the order itself, in a society that valued piety, discipline, and order. The Feast of Fools offered a rare opportunity for people to let go, to mock, to protest the system without actually overturning it. But, of course, it wasn't just the common people who participated in these festivals. Even the church itself, which had condemned these festivals as unholy and disorderly, found itself involved. As the Feast of Fools became more established, church leaders and even some of the clergy began to join in the revelry, often playing along with the mockery. Bishops and priests would dress in foolish costumes, carrying croziers made from wooden sticks and acting out ludicrous rituals. In some extreme cases, priests would even pretend to be possessed by demons, only to be exorcised by their fellow clergy. The fact that the church itself participated in these events only served to reinforce the idea that these festivals were not simply acts of rebellion, but rather a part of a larger ritual tradition, a way to temporarily disrupt the rigid power structures before they were carefully restored. And there was something innocent about this chaos. Unlike the ancient Roman Saturnalia, which was often accompanied by violent excess and bacchanalian indulgence, the Feast of Fools often had a soft quality of humor that leaned more toward play than to rage. In this sense, the Feast of Fools became not just a moment of release for the lower classes, but also a reaffirmation of the role of the church, even if that role was at times laughable. But it wasn't just humor that defined the feast. It was the strange freedom it allowed. In a society governed by strict codes of conduct, social stratification, and religious devotion, the Feast of Fools became the space where the rules were suspended, even if only for a few hours. And in a world of poverty and hardship, such moments of escape were immensely valuable. Villagers, workers, and peasants eagerly awaited the moment when their world would be flipped. The came to festivals not just for the merrymaking, but for the feeling of equality that came with the inversion of the social order. They did not just enjoy the spectacle, they took part in it. This was a world where laughter became power, and where the unworthy and the unwanted could briefly become kings, queens, or popes, even if only for a day. The true wildness of the Feast of Fools wasn't in the costumes or the food, but in the brief moment of freedom it allowed the lowest members of society to experience. As the medieval world marched through the centuries, the Feast of Fools and similar festivals were not isolated outbursts of collective whimsy. Rather, they became deeply woven into the cultural rhythm of cities and villages across Europe, evolving into highly anticipated events that carried meaning far beyond merriment. These were not just days of laughter, There were pauses in the year markers of time, where the sacred gave way to the profane, and the voices of the people echoed louder than those in power. By the late Middle Ages, the Feast of Fools began to blend into a wider universe of festivals that combined theatricality, civic pride, religious pageantry, and social commentary. As the church attempted to clamp down on more irreverent rituals, communities began to adapt, directing their energies into forms of expression that still allowed for celebration, but that increasingly emphasized public performance, masked roles, and staged satire. One notable development was the rise of guild-sponsored plays and processions, which became central features of public life. In places like York, Chester, and Coventry in England, mystery plays, biblical reenactments performed in the vernacular by the people, began to replace the more blasphemous elements of earlier festivals. These performances, while religious in nature, still allowed for humor, satire, and the occasional playful jab at authority. Through them, commoners participated in storytelling, constructing massive wagons, costumes, and props, turning city centers into mobile stages. Although these mystery plays were technically religious, their popularity made them deeply secular. In impact, the guilds that performed them, whether they were bakers, carpenters, or glovers, saw them not only as a form of piety, but also as public advertising, showcasing their wealth, skill, and devotion. The festival space became a platform for civic identity. A carpenter's guild might dramatize the building of Noah's Ark with dazzling stage machinery, not just to tell a story, but to demonstrate their craftsmanship in front of thousands of onlookers. In that sense, the festival became both a spiritual offering and a social performance. But the energy of festivals was not always so tame. Carnival, especially in Southern Europe, took on a different flavor, one that mirrored the older, wilder traditions of Saturnalia and the Feast of Fools. From Venice to Barcelona, Carnival was the most important event of the year, often leading up to the sober season of Lent. Masks were everywhere, leather, paper, metal, offering anonymity in a society obsessed with knowing your station, your face, your place. It was in this masked space that the magic of anonymity began to flourish. In Venice, in particular, masks allowed people to mingle across boundaries of class, gender, and religion. A beggar could flirt with a noblewoman. A merchant might pretend to be a monk. Servant could insult their master without consequence. These weren't just games, they were forms of subtle rebellion, challenges to a tightly ordered world. And the authorities, while wary, often allowed it. Because once the mask came off, society returned to its rigid lines. The release was temporary but necessary. In many cities, the ruling classes realized that festivals served a function far beyond entertainment. They allowed the people to exhale, to participate in their own way in public life, to feel sin even, if only through parody. The Lord of Misrule, or the Carnival King, often chosen from the lower classes, became symbols of both mockery and power. Their reigns were brief, but in their absurdity, they revealed how arbitrary real power could be. What made these festivals wild was not just the chaos or costuming, it was their capacity to hold contradictions. They were both sacred and profane, orderly and anarchic, spontaneous and heavily orchestrated, and because of these contradictions, became mirrors for the society that created them. Consider the Battle of the Flowers, held during some late medieval spring festivals in parts of southern France. On the surface, it was a joyful occasion, villagers throwing blooms at each other across town squares. But those flowers, thrown from one guild to another, or from farmers to merchants, weren't just petals in the air. They were gestures, sometimes kind, sometimes mocking. A weave toss from a weaver's child to a town official might draw laughs, but it might also carry the silent question, why do you never walk our side of the village? The same dynamic was found in the mock trials that became a staple of late medieval revelry. In these performances, townsfolk would put authority figures, real or fictional, on trial. The defendant might be a personification of greed or a symbolic representation of a corrupt tax collector, with judges in silly hats and juries drawn from children or jesters. The verdicts were always humorous, but the satire often struck a real nerve. People laughed, yes, but they also saw a version of justice not available in everyday life. And these traditions weren't limited to city squares or village greens. Monasteries, too, had their own versions. There are accounts of abbots secretly enjoying the feast of the Assa celebration, where a donkey might be led into the church, and its brays were parodied as liturgical chant. Such moments, though irreverent, were not always condemned. Some abbots believed that allowing such festivals relieved attention, prevented greater rebellion, and helped maintain the authority of the church by showing it could laugh at itself. At least sometimes, it's worth noting that in these festivals, laughter was not without danger. There were moments when the joke went too far. In one recorded festival in 14th century Dijon, a mock bishop declared an excommunication on the real bishop just for fun. But when the real bishop retaliated with genuine punishments, the people protested, forcing him to back down. The line between jest and insubordination had been crossed. if only briefly. In other places, the satire took on a more political edge. In German-speaking regions, leaf forms of Fasten-Spiel pre-Lenten farces developed into plays that criticized greedy merchants, inept leaders, and corrupt officials. The humor was raw, but it often included veiled messages. For the illiterate majority, such festivals became a source of news, gossip, and social commentary delivered through rhyme, performance, and parody. Over time, festivals became testing grounds for civic cooperation. Towns had to organize crowd control, build stages, appoint marshals, and coordinate between guilds. What began as spontaneous revelry evolved into municipal rituals involving councils, sponsors, and formal invitations. This transition marks one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval festivals, their slow evolution from chaotic celebrations to institutionalized public events. By the 15th century, cities like Nuremberg and Florence had entire departments devoted to festival organization. Budgets were allocated, guilds were given quotas for participation. Entire neighborhoods competed for the best floats, the most elaborate costumes, and the loudest cheers. The wildness was still there, but now it was managed, scheduled, and funded. And still, beneath the velvet and ribbons, the same primal energies stirred. People danced in circles until they collapsed. They played bagpipes in the streets that day, sang bawdy songs, and ate food they couldn't afford on any other day. Children saw their parents laugh. The poor felt rich for a moment, and in the candlelight of twilight, as the last of the wine was poured and the music slowed, people returned to their homes with something more than just memories. They carried the feeling, however brief, of belonging. Even today, echoes of these medieval festivals linger. Modern Mardi Gras, Notting Hill Carnival, the Lord Mayor's Show, and even local county fairs carry the DNA of the medieval street festival. The parades, the pageantry, the costumes, the music hall are descendants of those wild, messy days when villagers dressed as kings. Fools sat in thrones, and for once, everyone had a place in the performance. But what happens when society no longer needs the festival to release its tension? Or when those in power forget the lessons of the mock trial, the upside-down bishop, or the masked beggar who ruled the city square? By the dawn of the 16th century, the medieval world was beginning to crack at the seams. The Renaissance was stirring in Italy. The printing press was changing how information flowed across Europe. And the reformers, those sharp-tongued preachers and scribes, were beginning to question not just papal authority, but also the cultural practices of the people. At the center of their concern, oddly enough, stood the festivals. To understand the slow demise of the wild medieval festival, you must first understand how powerful it had become. What had started as a localized, mostly harmless release valve had become by some ease a symbol of disorder, irreverence, and even heresy. As new forms of centralized authority took shape, they, monarchies, urban councils, or Protestant churches, the idea of a masked beggar mocking the bishop, or a mock court sentencing a corrupt merchant, began to seem far more dangerous. The Protestant Reformation, sweeping across Northern Europe in the early 1500s, took a particularly dim view of festival culture. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin were not entirely united in their opinions, but the trend was clear. They sought discipline, austerity, and moral clarity, values that did not align with drunken jesters dancing through church aisles in places where Calvinism took hold, like Geneva, Scotland, and parts of the Netherlands. Many public festivals were outright banned. Clerical dress-up games, masked processions, and bawdy mystery plays were labeled idolatrous distractions. Church calendars were pared down. The line between holy day and workday blurred. The Feast of Fools became not a quaint tradition, but a target of moral reform. But it wasn't just the Protestants. The Catholic Church, during the Counter-Reformation, also sought to clean up its image. Following the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563. Catholic authorities began to crack down on what they deemed superstitious or indecent practices, a category that included many traditional festivals. Bishops sent letters, parish priests gave stern sermons, churchyards were locked during carnival. The image of the drunken cleric had become an embarrassment, even in cities that once embraced festival culture, like Paris, Rouen, or Barcelona. You can see the bureaucratic fingerprints of control emerging. In town council records from the 16th and 17th centuries, festival budgets begin to shrink. Edicts multiply. No costumes after dark. No fireworks without permission. No food stalls near the cathedral. The noise of the people, once tolerated and even celebrated, was gradually being muffled. Of course, not everyone obeyed. People still danced. They still drank, but the tone had shifted. What was once a collective inversion of power began to feel more like a scheduled performance. Carnival was still held in Venice and Cologne, and nice but under the watchful eyes of marshals and civic patrols. In many cases, festival goers were no longer participants, but spectators. The joy was still there, but the wildness had been tamed. What's perhaps most remarkable is how much effort it took to quiet the medieval festival spirit. Even as printing presses spread books of reason and religious discipline, the people still yearned for their moment of madness. In 17th century England, during the Puritan regime, maypoles were cut down and festivals suppressed, but when the monarchy was restored in 1660, so too were many of these long dormant customs. Still, the original spirit was hard to reclaim. In the decades of suppression, the memory of chaos had faded. What returned was a more decorated, sanitized version. The jesters no longer insulted the clergy. The plays became moral tales. The Lord of Misrule, once a daring figure of inversion, was now a quaint mascot, and perhaps that's the saddest part of all, not the banning of festivals, but the way they were transformed into something comfortable. A once living tradition, rich with contradiction and rebellion, had been repackaged into harmless nostalgia. By the 18th century, most of Europe had moved on. Public celebrations still occurred, but they served different purposes: military parades, coronation festivities, royal jubilees. The laughter was orchestrated. The scripts were approved. The people no longer mocked power, they clapped for it. And yet, if you listen closely, echoes remain. The legacy of these wild medieval festivals did not vanish entirely. Instead, it sank into the cultural soil, only to re-emerge in subtler forms. In every carnival mask in Rio or Venice, in every Halloween prank, in every town fair where the mayor dresses up and gives away candy, in every university satire magazine, in every protester wearing a Guy Fawkes mask, there's a little piece of the Feast of Fools. And that's perhaps the most profound truth about the wildness of medieval festivals. It was never meant to last forever. Wildness never does, but it doesn't disappear either. It simply waits. It hides in the cracks of order, in the quiet resistance of song and joke and dance, waiting for the next window of release. Some historians have argued that these festivals offered more than joy. They offered the illusion of democracy, not in the modern political sense, but in the spiritual sense, that, for a fleeting moment, every person, or the bishop or beggar, merchant or midwife, could stand on equal ground. The mask allowed it. The festival permitted it. The people made it real. And yet, perhaps the wildest thing about medieval festivals is this: they were never just about fun. They were about balance. They reminded people that power could be mocked, that rules could be bent, that life was not always solemn. In doing so, they stabilized society as much as they challenged it. Without those wild days, the ordinary days would have felt heavier. Without the mock trials, the real courts would have seemed crueler without the foolish kings. The real kings might have felt untouchable. And now, as we look back at these strange, joyous, blasphemous celebrations, we see not just parties, but windows into the human need for expression, rebellion, and connection. We see children covered in flour, chasing pigs through a town square. We see a man with a cabbage crown blessing his neighbors in jest. We see laughter echoing off the stone walls of a cold cathedral. And we wonder, we ever need festivals like that again? Will there come a time when the world feels so tightly wound, so full of invisible rules, that once more the people cry out and not in protest, but enjoy and demand a day where everything is upside down? And if they do, who will be the next Lord of Misrule? And what songs will we sing then? Good night.